Since time immemorial, plants and fungi have proven to be one of Homo sapiens' greatest resources, not just as sustenance, but as a fount of healing medicine, spiritual inspiration, and mystery. Humans do not merely utilize these species for these purposes, but are intrinsically involved in the cultural knowledge surrounding them, their domestication, and safekeeping. Imagine a world without painkillers, antibiotics, anticoagulants, anti-malarial medicines, or some chemotherapies, all of which have been either directly derived from, synthesized, or inspired by plants and fungi. And who would want to live in a world without the mystery and magic of poison-tipped arrows or hallucinogens? In Plants of the Gods podcast, renowned ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin, who has worked in and on the Amazon for almost 4 decades studying the relationship between humans and plants, takes his listeners on an inspiring journey from the most remote corners of Amazonia to other exotic locales. Learn about the fascinating history and uses of the plants of knowledge and power, like the hallucinogenic snuffs of the Yanomamo tribe, to coca, from which cocaine is derived, the ayahuasca liana, from which a hallucinogenic brew is produced, or the diverse formulations of curare, a plant mixture which relaxes the muscles of the body and leads to asphyxiation. Not only will you better understand what we know about these sacred species and how we use them, but how they are revolutionizing Western medicine while the fight is on to protect these healing species and the people who know them best. This and more from Plants of the Gods with Dr. Mark Plotkin.
I'm Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin of the Amazon Conservation Team. Glad to have you back here on the Plants of the Gods podcast. Today we're going to talk about, in some ways, the most intriguing and possibly the most ancient of the plants of the gods, that is opium, from the opium poppy. It's a bit unclear as to where the name opium comes from, but a colleague of mine who was a scholar of ancient Greek told me that opos in ancient Greek means plant juice or latex, like the white sap of a fig tree. And opion is the diminutive of opus and came to mean poppy sap, hence the name opium. It's been called a medicine, a poison, and a pleasure. And it has a most extraordinary history interwoven with things from the finding of the original Robinson Crusoe to the invention of the hypodermic syringe. But let me start by reading the greatest piece of poetry ever put on paper, as inspired by one of the plants of the gods. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. That was written by the famous romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge around the year 1797. He was awakening from an opium-induced dream. The lines came to him in his vision. He sat down and wrote the poem, and a few more lines when there was a knock at the door. And when he sat down to finish the poem, he couldn't remember it. So it's one of the great ironies of human history, Western artistic history, that this incredibly beautiful and inspiring imagery inspired by opium was lost to us, at least the rest of it was. And what's important here to take away is that these plants and these fungi sometimes inspire us to think differently, do differently, and devise visions, art, solutions to problems that we might not have come across without these mind-altering substances. This is not to say that these plants or these fungi or these frog secretions are always beneficial, because these plants of the gods can be detrimental, harmful, and even deadly as well. Now, no plant, no medicinal plant certainly, has ever been more widely employed than opium, nor has helped save as many lives, or has eased as much suffering, or has caused as much suffering and death, as I'll get to later in the podcast. But I want to emphasize that this effect of opium in particular, and other mind-altering plants and fungi on our arts, on our history, is not restricted to poetry. The great Jelly Roll Morton, the pianistic genius from my hometown of New Orleans, helped invent jazz at the beginning of the 20th century in the red light district known as Storyville. This was a hotbed of creativity and gave birth to great musicians like Buddy Bolden or Louis Armstrong in a way. And we have to remember, and this is really poorly documented in most of the history books, that these mind-altering plants played a role as well. Here's Jelly Roll from his classic autobiography, Mr. Jelly Roll, talking about what it was like to stroll down the streets of Storyville in the early 20th century. Music was pouring into the streets from every house. Women were standing in the doorways, singing or chanting some kind of blues. Some very happy, some very sad, some with the desire to end it all by poison. Some planning a big outing, a dance, or some other kind of enjoyment. Some were real ladies in spite of their downfall, and some were habitual drunkards, and some were dope fiends, as follows: opium, heroin, cocaine, laudanum, morphine. I was personally sent to Chinatown many times with a sealed note and a small amount of money, and would bring back several cards of hop. Hop was opium. Now, in listening to Jelly Roll's list, one thing jumps out at me. He names 5 drug compounds: opium, heroin, cocaine, laudanum, and morphine. Opium, heroin, laudanum, and morphine all come from the opium poppy. Only cocaine is a separate plant. It just shows the impact and the ubiquity of this drug and its mind-altering and pain-numbing capabilities. And it was sold openly in the Chinatown of New Orleans, which is along Tulane Avenue. And the role of the Chinese and the way they suffered as a result of the opium trade is a major part of the story, which I'll be getting to. Now, the opium poppy is native to the Middle East. It's been in use for at least 10,000 years. We can say that it is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, of the plants of the gods, at least in terms of documented use, at least in terms of archaeological ruins that can be accurately dated. It is a member of the Papaveraceae family. It was found in the ruins of the Swiss lake dwellers in southern Europe, and that is how we know it's been used at least as long as 10,000 years and probably a lot longer. One of the other early finds of opium use is a Cretan terracotta statue of a goddess, which has been dated to about 1500 BC. Her hair is adorned with 3 opium poppy capsules. The statue has become so emblematic of the plants of the gods that it serves as the symbol of the prestigious Journal of Ethnopharmacology. And I encourage everyone to look up this image on the internet, and you can see that the goddess is smiling with closed eyes and is believed to be in an opium trance. Now, the first documented cultivation of the opium poppy was by the Sumerians in the Fertile Crescent around 3400 BCE. The earliest mention of the medical use of opium dates back to the reign of Assurbanipal around 600 BCE. It was employed widely in Sumerian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Indian, Persian, and Arab medicine. The earliest discovery of opium prepared as a medicine is from the tomb of the Egyptian royal architect Cha, dated to the 15th century of BCE. In fact, opium was widely used for many purposes in ancient Egypt. It was repeatedly recommended in the Ebers Papyrus, from about 1350 BCE, which is the most important of the medical papyri that are survived through the ages. It lists 2 essential uses: pain relief and as a soporific to induce sleep. Both the Greek physician Dioscorides, around 50 CE, and the Roman naturalist Theophrastus, around 300 BCE, recommended opium for these purposes. And we heard a lot more about these important figures in the podcast episode on the history of medical wine. Dioscorides, interestingly enough, was one of the first known ethnobotanists. He was a military physician in Nero's army and collected information on healing plants during his travels. His book De Materia Medica served as a standard ethnomedical reference for 15 centuries. And one of the great stories about him is that he was traveling with the Roman army in what we now know as Holland, and the soldiers were suffering from scurvy, which of course can be cured by vitamin C. And as an ethnobotanist, he asked the local tribes people what they use for the disease, and they showed him dock, which is indeed rich in vitamin C. Once again, it shows that ethnobotany, once again, it shows that local peoples know what they're talking about. Of course, scurvy is most famous in the annals of Western history, particularly Western military history, because it had a very detrimental effect on British sailors who were at sea for sometimes years at a time. And only with the discovery of citrus fruit, which comes from tropical Asia, that they began to have this as part of their rum ration and became known as limeys as a result. Now, a famous passage in the Odyssey refers to opium and calls it nepenthe. At least we believe it was opium, because it's a drug that induces forgetfulness. And here's a quote from Homer. Helen, daughter of Zeus, poured a drug, nepenthe, into the wine they were drinking, which made them forget all evil. And this tincture of opium, which we now know as laudanum, has been used as a medical staple through the ages, and I'll be talking a bit more about that. Now, some have said that this might have been absinthe, wormwood, hashish, or some other cannabis derivative. I think that opium is the most compelling candidate. Laudanum reached its peak in the 19th century. It was important not only as a painkiller, but as an antitussive, that is, as a cough medicine, as an antidiarrheal. And if you work in the Amazon, you know tincture of opium, which is another name for laudanum. It's incredibly effective as an antidiarrheal. And when we remember, water sanitation wasn't very good until relatively recent in human history. So this use of opium is often underestimated or underreported in the history books. It was also used as a mind-expanding drug, particularly in the artistic world. I gave the example of Coleridge's Kubla Khan poem. It was very heavily used by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet, and most famously of all by Thomas de Quincey, who wrote a book entitled Confessions of an English Opium Eater. The French composer Berlioz not only glorified opium, but he wrote a symphony about it called Symphonie Fantastique. Opium addiction figures in a negative way in Eugene O'Neill's famous play, A Long Day's Journey into Night, and also figures in a sort of positive way in To Kill a Mockingbird, where the woman overcomes her addiction by listening to the young child who's the protagonist read her short stories. Now, as I said, opium and the opium poppy was native to the Middle East, but it's believed to have been brought as far east as India by Alexander the Great on his voyage of conquest. It then began to be cultivated in many Muslim countries, certainly as a medicine, and possibly as a replacement for wine, because as we talked about in the podcast online, with the banning of wine and drunkenness in the sacred Quran, people always look for mind-altering substances. They did it in ancient times, they do it today. And that may have been one of the incentives to start growing poppies when wine was essentially outlawed. From there, it moved to China. Now, for many reasons, I gave you the example of Jelly Roll Morton and the use of opium in Storyville. We tend to associate opium with the Chinese, but opium was not native to China. Opium was not smoked in China until much more recent times. And ironically, opium was sort of forgotten about in its native land of the northern Middle East, Europe. With the fall of the Roman Empire, for a couple of centuries, it was lost. And it was only when the Muslims swept west to conquer Europe, all the way to the Pyrenees, that opium was reintroduced to Europe and became once again a medical staple. And the man most famous in Europe for popularizing the use of opium was Paracelsus in the 16th century. Paracelsus was a Swiss-German alchemist, and though he's known as Paracelsus, his original name was Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. I think we can all agree that's a pretty bombastic name, and I think we can all understand why it was easier to be called Paracelsus than this long Swiss-German name. Paracelsus is known as the father of toxicology. He was something of an early ethnobotanist wandering around Europe looking at local cures and dispensing them as an ethnobotanist healer. And he is best known to the modern world as the inventor of laudanum. Laudanum is opium in an alcohol tincture. Now, as I said, opium in alcohol was used long before Paracelsus. I think Hippocrates recommended it in the age of classical Greece. But Paracelsus brought it to the fore. And this is a plant compound. This is a plant of the god that did a lot of good and did a lot of harm. It was called laudanum from the Latin word laudare, to praise, because it was so useful for a variety of things. It was used to induce sleep. It was used to inhibit pain, which is probably the most important use for morphine and opium and all the other derivatives. And we'll talk a bit more about that. But it was brought to the commercial notice of England by a fascinating fellow named Thomas Dover. Thomas Dover was not only a businessman, he was a pirate in sense. I guess you could call that a businessman in the broad sense. But he created something called Dover's powder, which was used for hundreds of years in England and I think only banned in the 1960s. But when they did the analysis of Dover's powder, it was found to consist mostly of opium and ipecac. Ipecac is a famous emetic from the Amazon. But he is at least as well known for Dover's powder as for being on the voyage that rescued Alexander Selkirk. Alexander Selkirk was, I think, also a pirate or privateer who went ashore in a very remote island because he believed the ship would sink and was essentially marooned for several years. And when he was rescued and brought back to England, his story fascinated people everywhere. And Daniel Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe based primarily on the adventures of Alexander Selkirk. Now, another important date in the history of opium and opium usage and abusage was 1803, because this was the year that a German chemist by the name of Saturner isolated morphine. A bit of background on the isolation of morphine, because this was important not only in terms of studying and understanding the plants of the gods, but very important in terms of medicine and the history of medicine. This is from a book called High Society, The Central Role of Mind-Altering Drugs in History, Science, and Culture by Mike J., who's a very good historian of entheogenic substances. He writes, and I quote, "In 1803, a young German pharmacist's apprentice named Friedrich Saturner began experimenting with the tarry opium concentrate, attempting to reduce its acidic components. Over many years, he produced a number of obscure substances which he tested on himself and others. Eventually, in 1817, he isolated a compound that formed clear crystals soluble in acid, though only slightly soluble in water. This was morphine, the very first instance of a plant chemical, an alkaloid, being isolated from a plant. This was incredibly important for a variety of reasons." Jay goes on to write, "This is the first time that a plant had given up not merely an essence or a tincture, but a pure chemical substance in its own right. And Saturner made several observations that laid the framework for the isolation of pharmaceutical plant extracts. Having painfully established over a decade that these active components were not acids, as he and others had assumed, he classified them as vegetable alkali, later to be known as alkaloids, because remember, alkaloids are basic as opposed to acidic. Saturner also established that crystallization was the best way to isolate them, and once isolated, to keep them from contamination by other substances. These discoveries would transform chemistry, particularly in Germany, into an industrial science supplying new plant-derived compounds to a vast pharmaceutical market. Caffeine would be isolated from coffee in 1820 and nicotine from tobacco in 1828. In 1832, an entirely separate substance, codeine, would be found alongside morphine in the juice of the poppy head." So this really launched much of the biomedical revolution in terms of purifying and essentially making much more strong and effective medicines from plants. Morphine is 10 times more potent than pure opium, and this led to the invention of the hypodermic syringe in 1853, which was invented in part to get opium and particularly morphine into the bloodstream where it's much more potent. A lot of opium and opium alkaloids are denatured and digested in the stomach and are much less potent than when they're shot right into the bloodstream. So the good news is that this development made it much more effective as a pain reliever, but the bad news is addiction came to the fore. Now, addiction was noticed by people for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So this wasn't news. However, the purified form shot directly into the human bloodstream made it much more dangerous. Morphine is an incredibly addictive drug. Now, in talking about opium, it's well known as a narcotic, but many people aren't really quite sure what a narcotic is. The strict definition is that it induces central nervous system depression, which results in numbness, sleep, or lethargy. Now, under this definition, it means that narcotics would include opium and opiates, as well as alcoholic beverages. However, in contemporary usage, the term narcotic is applied to any psychoactive compound that is addictive, so we would have to include cocaine under that rubric. The majority of these plants of the gods have active compounds, which are in fact alkaloids. A notable exception is marijuana. THC is not an alkaloid, and we'll be talking about that in the marijuana episode or episodes. And that noteworthy is that most of these alkaloids are found in plants or fungi in the natural world. Angiosperms, that is flowering plant families that are well known for containing psychoactive alkaloids, include the Solanaceae, the Papaveraceae, the opium family, the Erythroxylaceae, the coca family, and the Myristicaceae, the nutmeg family, that we have discussed in the episode on snuffs. Ironically, there's a lot of alkaloids being found in the orchid family, the Orchidaceae, which are not used for any psychoactive purposes that we know of, but the more research we do, the more interesting things we find. Now, alkaloids are a diverse group of compounds, and there are over 3,000 known. They've been found in 4,000 species of plants, and I predict we'll end up finding a lot more as we do more thorough research. What makes an alkaloid is their chemical structure. They typically have a ring. They are basic in the sense they're not acidic, and they typically have a bitter taste, which I'm convinced is how many people found alkaloids in the first place. A plant that is bitter is often regarded as good for you. The concept of bitters is found as far back in the Bible and even further back. Some of the most famous alkaloids include caffeine, nicotine, cocaine, quinine, and morphine, which is found in opium. And if you've ever tasted quinine, you'll never forget it. It's one of the most bitter substances known. There are more than 30 alkaloids that have been found in opium, the most important of which are morphine and codeine. One might wonder, why would these plants find receptors in the human body? Why would a plant give you a sensation of pleasure? And the thought is that there are binding sites set up for endorphins, the rush you get after exercise or when you're feeling good, that these things attach to. And that is why these compounds, which we believe the plants evolved to essentially keep away and confuse insect pests or other herbivores that would otherwise prey on them, ironically have a place in the human brain and nervous system which generate a physiological reaction which, as we have seen, can be pleasurable, can be inspirational, and that research remains ongoing. Now, the most important alkaloid in opium, the most common, is morphine, which can be up to 10% of what's in opium, which is the plant latex. And it was used to treat injured Civil War soldiers, addiction not being fully understood. morphine addiction became so common it was known as the soldier's disease. And many of the patent medicines of the day, I gave the example of Dover's pills, Dover's powders, had opium and opium compounds, morphine in them, and resulted in tremendous problems with addiction. Interestingly enough, morphine is still the drug of choice for the control of intense pain, terminal cancer, severe burns, visceral pain during post-op, and kidney stones, which are among the most painful problems which can suffer. Morphine is also administered in some cases to patients suffering from heart failure. Codeine, which is the second most common alkaloid in opium, is particularly valid as an oral analgesic. It is the most effective cough medicine or cough medicine component. With all the terrible problems that have come out of the recent scandals about opium and opiate addictions, it's much harder to get a prescription for this stuff now. It used to be much easier, but its effectiveness, as far as I'm concerned, has never been equaled by any of the synthetics. Now, heroin was created by the Bayer Company in 1898 and introduced to the market as what was believed to be a non-addictive opiate. It was widely dispensed, it showed up in cough syrups, but it now turns out that we know that heroin is 6 times more addictive than morphine. It's used in many countries, not in the US, medicinally to control severe pain, and it is produced primarily in India. India is, in fact, the largest legal producer of opium, alkaloids, and heroin for medical uses, although it's also grown widely in the so-called Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia, and it's appeared in Mexico and Colombia as another illegal crop that generates enormous profits and causes terrible social problems. So just to clarify, opium contains many different alkaloids. Morphine is the most common, the most prevalent. About 10% of opium latex can be morphine, and it was first isolated by the German chemist Saturn. It was the first purified alkaloid that was extracted from a plant. And the hypodermic syringe was developed about 50 years later, which made it possible for doctors to rapidly inject this potent painkiller, that is morphine, into the bloodstream. So morphine use escalated rapidly. Of course, that was both a blessing and a curse, because it increased addiction. So scientists then put on their thinking caps and looked for something which would be a non-addictive painkiller. And the result was a semi-synthetic compound, heroin. Heroin is, in fact, a more powerful and effective analgesic than morphine. And like morphine, it was believed to be non-addictive. It was so effective, it was considered heroic, hence the name heroin. And it was introduced by the Bayer Company in 1888 or 1889 in a cough syrup. So once again, you had this addiction spreading throughout the population with the best of intentions, which was to alleviate suffering, but in effect causing much worse suffering than it was originally designed to treat and cure. The opium poppy has been grown, domesticated for thousands of years. And many fail to realize that it's a multi-purpose plant. It's not just a source of opium and opiate alkaloids like morphine. It's also the source of poppy seeds. Poppy seeds are widely used in many cuisines. It is the center of the Hamantaschen that the Jews used to celebrate the religious holiday of Purim. Poppy seeds are widely used in a variety of dishes. In fact, it's a staple in many forms of curry that many don't seem to be aware of. So over the course of so many years, there's many different forms, many different versions, many different varieties of opium poppies. In some cases, you want to produce lots of morphine for the drug trade, legal or illegal. In some cases, you want to produce little or no morphine or other opiate alkaloids. You just want to produce a lot of poppy seeds. And that is why We see so many versions of the opium poppy, and keep in mind it's also a beautiful and widely grown ornamental. So in this sense, it's not unlike cannabis, which is not only utilized for its mind-altering or mind-enhancing purposes, it's also used for its high-quality fiber and its edible seeds. We'll be talking more about that in the episode on cannabis.
To purchase Dr. Mark Plotkin's new book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know, or his first book, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, visit your local bookseller or order from Amazon.com.
Now, in the 17th century in China, another efficient form of morphine delivery to the central nervous system was created, and that was by smoking, by the smoking of opium. We tend to associate opium smoking, opium dens with ancient China, but there was no smoking before the introduction of tobacco, ironically, from the New World. So you had the introduction of tobacco, you had the introduction of smoking an herb, which was completely foreign to the Chinese experience. And so this type of globalization, this type of moving plants and plant use around the world has to be seen as having negative effects, in addition to many of the positive effects, which are more obvious. Smoking tobacco is believed to have been introduced to China by the Portuguese, and they soon began growing opium to mix with their tobacco, which made both plant products more effective, more potent. And in the Ming Dynasty in the early 17th century, the Imperial Court of China declared a prohibition against smoking tobacco, which included the smoking of tobacco with opium. But smoking pure opium was exempt. It's one of these loopholes in the law that had many deleterious effects. And at this point, opium smoking and, more tragically, opium addiction ran rampant. So addiction spread rapidly throughout China, and this caught the attention of Portuguese merchants who began importing opium from India. In 1773, the British East India Company established a monopoly on opium production, and they began importing opium from India to China directly, which they traded for Chinese goods like silks and pottery and other high-end merchandise. This resulted in the so-called Opium Wars, where when the Chinese didn't want opium brought in, the British and later I think the Americans brought it in with gunboats. This is really one of the ugliest and most tragic episodes in the history of colonialism, forcing addiction, forcing addictive plants into the lands where they were not wanted. And though opium had been banned throughout the United Kingdom at some point, to make this especially ironic. By the time of the Chinese Revolution, it's been estimated that over 50 million Chinese people were addicts. In 1949, when the communist forces seized Shanghai, which was a port through which opium was introduced to China, brought into China, drug dealers were publicly executed, and Chairman Mao threatened to kill 20 million opium addicts within a 24-hour period. This was perhaps the first war on drugs. And in the words of my colleagues Balick and Cox, this was a war on drugs that proved grimly successful. At the time, the Chinese basically looked down on much of the rest of the world, and they had these fabulous products like silks and pottery, spices, and there really wasn't much that the British could offer. So the British realized that there was a market for opium, and it grew well in India, which of course was part of the British Raj. So the import of opium into England was illegal, ironically, but they basically fought their way into China and began selling it there. The Chinese tried to stop this because they see the deleterious effects, but it came to a head in 1839 when the Chinese confiscated and destroyed the British opium supplies in Canton, which was the port of entry. The British came back by launching a war, the so-called First Opium War, which ended up in a treaty which ceded Hong Kong, which had always been Chinese, to the British. A second opium war broke out a few years later in 1865, and the Chinese lost again. They were forced to agree to the further importation of British opium, and the Chinese consumption and the Chinese addiction continued to escalate. Never underestimate the impact of this horrible episode on the Chinese psyche in terms of the humiliation, in terms of the degradation, in terms of the determination to get even and rise from the humiliation inflicted on them by the British. When Mao took over, he outlawed opium smoking. He killed many of the opium dealers and threatened to kill all opium addicts in a 24-hour period. This has been described as the only really effective war on drugs, grimly effective, in the word of my ethnobotanical colleagues, Paul Cox and Mike Balick. A medical toxicologist has recently pointed out that opium from the poppy and its derivatives, heroin, morphine, are the greatest cause of plant-related poisonings and death in the U.S. and probably the world. Opium production in Afghanistan, which is the source of about 90% of the world's heroin supply, has steadily increased over the past few decades. It's currently estimated that the value of the opium trade in Afghanistan is worth over $4 billion, billion with a B, annually, in a very, very, very poor country, which is why the issue of trying to control or even eradicate the opium trade has been a failure and probably doomed to failure. And those monies are distributed between farmers, warlords, corrupt officials, insurgents throughout the country. Now, heroin and these other opiates remains illegal in the U.S. and most other countries of the world. However, these restrictions have resulted in the creation of synthetics like fentanyl or oxycodone, which is synthesized from thebaine, which is another alkaloid in opium poppies, and has resulted in enormous profits for the seller of these compounds, as well as terrible, terrible addiction problems. The point I want to make here is this: opium, like all the plants of the gods, is literally a two-edged sword. And remember, the classic case of the two-edged sword in the history of the world was when Columbus landed on the beach in the island of San Salvador in the Bahamas. He pulled out his sword from his scabbard and declared these lands as belonging to the King and Queen of Spain. The Native American chief, who'd never seen steel before, reached up and grabbed the blade of the sword, and it cut him, and he bled on the sand. What that means is swords, and the whole notion of the two-edged swords is derived in some sense from incidents like these. Steel, swords, scalpels, they can heal, they can harm. And that's true of all of the plants of the gods. That is why it is so important, whether you're taking painkillers in a hospital, whether you're taking ayahuasca with a shaman in the Amazon, or whether you're smoking opium in Southeast Asia, it always has to be under the supervision of somebody who knows what they're doing, preferably an experienced healer. These plants, these fungi, are not to be trifled with. They can heal, they can harm. We see it with the terrible cases of addiction throughout the world. We see it with the terrible violence that's resulted in the illegal trade of these compounds. At the same time, we're seeing new vistas, new doors opening in the use of these magical plants in healing and sometimes curing so-called incurable diseases. So the opportunities have never been greater. The challenges and dangers have never been greater. The choices await us. So to sum up, because we've covered so much ground here, opium is a plant, but opium is also the latex of that plant that contains so many alkaloids, in fact, more than 25 by some estimation. The most common and most important of these alkaloids is morphine, which is still widely used for pain relief. Another very important one of these opium alkaloids is codeine, which is still used as a cough suppressant. And yet another important one of these alkaloids is papaverine, which treats intestinal spasms. So it's a major component in many antidiarrheal medicines like paregoric. Laudanum that we talked about is simply opium dissolved in alcohol. Typically in the ancient world, where it was very popular, it was dissolved in wine. Heroin was developed by Bayer in the hopes of creating a non-addictive compound. It was developed around 1898 and sold as an over-the-counter cough medicine for children. So that lasted about 20 years before people realized that it was highly addictive and it was yanked off the market. Final note, the last drug, the last substance given to patients dying in very painful conditions like terminal cancer is often opium. And remember that the sleep-inducing alkaloid in opium is morphine. And morphine, appropriately enough, is named after Morpheus, the god of sleep.
This has been Plants of the Gods, Healing, Culture, and Conservation with Dr. Mark Plotkin. Stay tuned for more stories about shamans, hallucinogens, entheogens, unique religious and cultural histories, and rainforest adventures and cures. If you enjoyed this episode, please recommend us to your friends and rate and review on iTunes. To learn more about the mystery and splendor of the Amazon rainforest, find Dr. Plotkin's latest book, The Amazon: What Everyone Needs to Know, on Amazon.com or your local bookstore.
If you have any questions about today's episode, direct message us on our Twitter or Instagram at Doc Mark Plotkin or Facebook Plants of the Gods Pod, and the questions will be answered by me. Follow our Facebook page for more information, or check the Amazon Conservation Team webpage, www.amazonteam.org, for more information on our field programs. Excited to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in.